know a number of charities have set up working groups, EDI working groups. So, and I know many people are keen to see how they can effectively use them to achieve the mission and to improve their EDI. So, Matt, what are your suggestions there?
So for me, there has to be more of a strategic intention behind why we're implementing these groups. So what specifically are you trying to solve by putting in place the groups? How are you going to solve it? So what's firmly within the remit of the group? You know, what are you expecting members of that group to actually do on a day-to-day basis? And then kind of what is in the remit of the organization and what is the interaction between those two aspects. So for me, it's about really being intentional about the change that you want to make. There's no point creating a group if there's no clear articulation or vision of what you expect to change by that group being formed. I spoke a little bit about kind of the link as well. I think that's really important from both a vertical and horizontal perspective. So horizontally, you know, how do these groups collaborate? How do they share experiences? We speak a lot about intersectionality. How do you accommodate for potentially a woman of color who is part of the LGBT plus community? You know, by by kind of extraction, that person could potentially fall into 3 working groups. Does she or they go to the female group for kind of the female issues? Do they go to the LGBTQ plus group for the LGBTQ plus issues? Do they go to the BAME group or Black Network for those issues? You know, how do these networks communicate? How do they collaborate? How do they ensure that there's efficiency to enable people that do have intersectional characteristics to make sure they don't have to participate in 3 groups, which is usually in addition to their workload. And I think in terms of the vertical, how do these groups collaborate with the organization? You know, how does the leadership team get visibility of their concerns? How do they ensure that they're doing the right things at an organizational level that means that they don't necessarily jeopardize the work that's going on in the group? And finally, I just want to touch on resourcing. I think it's important that these groups are fully resourced. What we often find is that these groups are formed, there's an expectation that people will work on the groups in addition to their day jobs without a budget, without a clear strategy, without, you know, face time from leadership. So it's important that you get the resourcing side of things right and really have that full, you know, that full circle in terms of the strategic intention, the communication, the collaboration, and the resourcing side of things.
That was so comprehensive. I'm like, what do I even say? Something that I found really interesting recently. I've never been in a network before. Full disclosure, I'm like a lone wolf. But where I've seen networks go wrong and these kind of working groups go wrong is where leadership use it as an opportunity to maintain their power, right? And, you know, really effective working groups are ones where there is a power shift, and the power is kind of shifted to those with lived experience of marginalized identities. There shouldn't be no kind of, you know, people of privilege really leading this. And I think that's where things go really wrong. And sometimes it's well-meaning leaders who really want to support or may think they want to support by being there, but actually the whole dynamic of the group changes, right? And I think it goes back to that. What are you trying to achieve with this group? Are you trying to keep an eye on the marginalized people in the organization? Are you trying to spy on them to see whether they're trying to take the organization down? Because sometimes, you know, I think being aware of the power that you hold in that space when you're a leader is really, really, really important, because I've seen leaders with privilege take over the process, dilute the work, shrink the marginalized people in the group, and then trust is broken again. And then when those without power say, actually, we don't want you in this group, you're holding things back, it becomes about this leader kind of like digging their heels back in. And it's really about that kind of process of humility, acknowledging the power that you have and the power that you bring into spaces, and realizing that that power is what's got us in this problem in the first place. And sometimes that means taking a step back and exercising a lot of trust. But actually, if you have those like really clear communication channels between these groups and your leadership, so that it's, you know, there's always transparency, you're actually going to find that really amazing ideas are coming out of these people who've never really had the chance to input into kind of the strategic direction of an organization before. I would also say that you should start with getting an external facilitator in to help them define their purpose, set their goals, define their values, and think about what tactics they're going to use, because you kind of need to get kind of tight quickly, I'd say, rather than, you know, having all of these pointless meetings where you're like, what are we doing? Who are we? You know, and kind of like, yeah, wasting time. And I think if you're not willing to resource these groups, then you are going to end up with groups that are a little lost, you know. So yeah, it's really important to be thinking about this as part of work.
Yeah, I really wanted to kind of touch on one of the things you're saying about leadership and their role within these groups. I think one of the things that we hear in the work that we do from leaders is that they're not sure what their role is. You know, how do we support these groups? How do we ensure that there's sufficient visibility at the executive level? Yeah, what are your reflections on kind of, obviously you mentioned humility. I guess what practically can leaders do if they want to potentially set up a network or sponsor a network?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it differs from organization to organization, to be honest. And I think if you go about this with a monolith approach, that it's going to be the same network in each organization, you're setting people up to fail. If I take kind of like race equity groups as just like an example from my own career, I would say that, you know, if the people who have lived experience of the issues that you're trying to tackle are not centered into it, then it's a completely pointless group, right? And actually it can be really difficult because, say, you have no people of color in leadership positions, you have no one who isn't a straight white man in a leadership position. Will the people who, you know, are people of color, who are queer or whatever, really feel like they can get anything done, that they'll be taken seriously, or that, you know, they have any power with people being in that group? I think it's really like a difficult discussion that needs to be had with the people who should be centered in this work. Not in you know, in some groups it might be that actually the leadership take a bit of a step back. They do sponsor, right? In some groups it will be that the leadership are part of it, but it's something that needs to be really discussed. It needs to come from with the people with lived experience at the heart, and sometimes that's difficult and messy, and it's not going to feel nice. And I think we're always expecting EDI work to feel fantastic, you know, like this is going to be like feel good moments, but actually we're talking about power here, and like, you know, kind of looking at power and dismantling some oppressive power structures is difficult. So difficult decisions need to be made.
It's interesting because some of the things that you're talking about are really like a need for a culture shift first. Almost, you can't just create these groups and expect it all to, you know, work out. You know, there needs to be a challenge of structures and representation in different ways. So it does lead on to the next topic, which is how do we actually create that inclusive culture?
Did you want to go first?
Okay, yeah, I'll give that my 2 cents. And for me, I mean, it's a really difficult one. I think it's about getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? Because there needs to be these open, continuous, candid conversations about power and privilege at all levels, and whether that's around class, gender, race, sexuality, disability, faith, whatever. We need to be talking about these things and acknowledging where we've fallen short, and taking real intentional steps to address these kind of cultural issues. And I think I said this last time, but I'll say it again. People with power and privilege need to practice saying sorry, right? Because, you know, you're going to get called out for saying racist microaggressions or misgendering someone, or a huge organizational failing, right? And what happens more often than not is that the person who's called out will double down, get defensive, make it all about them. And it's actually incredibly childish to do that, when really it's about the harm that's been caused, and it should be centering the person who's been harmed. So I'd say getting good at apologizing is like the most chilled thing in the world. Like it's not that deep, you know. I'm sorry, I realize my actions and words were wrong and offensive and have caused you harm, and this is what I'm going to do to make amends. So I'd say like 2 very simple things is like be okay with being uncomfortable and get ready to say sorry and to mean it as well.
I think that's amazing. I think yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with you that, you know, on this journey we're all going to make mistakes. You know, nobody is perfect. Nobody gets into a leadership position and is a born leader. there needs to be recognition that actually, you know, sometimes well, a lot of the time, probably 99% of the time, you're learning on the job. You know, you're learning about your organization, you're learning about the type of organization that you want to be. And, you know, that takes some time, and it is uncomfortable sometimes. I think for me, when we're talking about culture, it's about acknowledging what culture is. It's the things that we do on a regular basis, our beliefs, our traditions. I think there has to be some intentionality around inclusivity. So when we're talking about culture, what is the culture that we want to see, and what are the actions, behaviors, and consequences that go along with that? So it's important to have some form of articulation about what your expectations are versus what is unacceptable. And really sticking to those, you know, those standards that you set for yourself. I think there's obviously what you aspire to be and what you actually are. So there needs to be recognition of what that gap is. But there needs to be some intention around how you get to where you want to be. And a lot of that is the work that I think you alluded to before, Martha, in terms of learning and development. So potentially getting in external consultants, or you know, having more opportunities for people to explore their own behaviors and their own actions, and what they do on a day-to-day basis, what they like, what they dislike. And it's one of the things that I'm learning with the Equal Group, you know, how to develop an inclusive culture. I think there needs to be acknowledgement that what you perceive the company to be as a leader is markedly different from what other people perceive the company to be. So there has to be a means for people to be open and honest about the things that they like, the things that they dislike. And you as a leader have to be open to hearing the good and the bad. I think sometimes we can get overinflated with the good and not take as much time to recognize the bad. And I think it comes down to what you're saying, Martha, in terms of being open to apologize, being open to be transparent, to be vulnerable. It is difficult, but that's the only way that we'll get to a better situation. We can't, as you said, we can't be stubborn and dig our heels in and say, you know, that's just you and that's just your perspective. It's about really trying to be deliberate in terms of how we identify the areas where we've potentially fallen short.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, like you spoke about. I'm vigorously writing notes here. You know, that acknowledgement about where you want to be, but actually honesty about where you are. And this piece is missing from the charity sector, right? And I think we've seen it quite recently with what's happened with NCBO, is that there was the organization thought that they were, you know, trailblazers on EDI. Meanwhile, you know, there's discrimination going on at all levels in the organization based on race, disability, sexuality, etc. And I think, yeah, there is a level of kind of getting over yourself. Really, just because we're doing good work doesn't make us good people. And, you know, discrimination and racism and all the isms, it's not about good and bad. So yeah, definitely that level of honesty is hard, but it's so important, because you're going to get caught out. There's nowhere to hide really now.
It's an interesting one as well, and obviously you brought up the NCVO issues and kind of what's been going on over the last couple of months. But I think you're completely right in terms of the intentionality. I think one of the mistakes that people often make is the comparison to society. I think society is generally not great at inclusivity. So if that's your benchmark, and I think you said it before the call, that the benchmark for some of this stuff is so low that it's
on the floor.
Exactly. So there has to be some intentionality around the type of culture that you want to create, and it can't be just a reflection of society, because we already know that society is deeply flawed.
Very true. Okay, so and I know a number of people have shared concerns about how they can actually, you know, get EDI as a priority within their organisations, and some of the barriers that might come from management and leadership. So what is your advice for how they can gain that support that they need for EDI?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting one. I was having a conversation with a consultant that's due to join us at the end of the month, Alan, and we're talking about the business case for diversity and inclusion, and you're talking about the finances and the McKinsey report and all of this. And I think there's obviously a financial case, but but I don't necessarily like using the financial case because, and maybe it's because I'm a little bit of an idealist, but I really don't think that we should be saying that, you know, we want to do diversity and inclusion because it will make us more money. Like seems like one of the most disgusting things that we can do. But if you are interested and if you think your leaders are very, very much kind of wedded to the idea that you have to make money, there's stacks and stacks of research that demonstrate, you know, innovation, productivity, all of these things will increase if you invest in equality, diversity, and inclusion. I think in addition to the financial case, there's a social case. You know, what does it mean to be a good individual? What does it mean to be a good organization? And that is, you know, the link between being good and getting good outputs and diversity and inclusion is so strong that it's ridiculous for you to feel that you can, as you said before, Martha, achieve mission without taking into consideration equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I think for me as well, that the additional kind of lever is sustainability. You know, the world is changing. Things are becoming more diverse. Things are becoming more visible. If you're an organization that doesn't take this seriously, your days are numbered. You know, we've seen the impact of social media. We've seen the impact of, you know, things like the Black Lives Matter movement, where these things that happen in kind of isolated communities just expand exponentially and become global issues. And as an organization, you don't want to be at the heart of that. You don't want to be on the back foot when kind of society decides to to kind of highlight and spotlight the areas where we need to improve.
Yeah, I completely agree. You don't want to be on the wrong side of history. We've kind of seen that, yeah, there's nowhere to hide anymore. But yeah, like you said, for me, it goes back to achieving mission. How can you achieve mission if you're only catering to a percentage of society with your services? Ultimately, your leaders are not particularly good at their jobs if they're not taking EDI seriously. And I think when you start thinking about EDI as something over there, you know, something that's a bit of a nice to have rather than something that should be woven into the fabrics of absolutely every single part of your organizational strategy, from your finances strategy to your marketing strategy to your operational strategy. Why is it not woven in? It's not just something that we can pick up off the shelf every now and then when someone calls us up for doing something racist. You know, we're like, here's our EDI policy that we never actually use and we never embed into anything ever, right? And I think something that I think is really, I agree with you, Mac, I don't care for the business case for diversity. One, we're in the charity sector, so we shouldn't really be talking about that anyway. But why would you not want to be inclusive? Like, why are people having to ask you, like beg you to be inclusive? Like, it's actually, it's quite insulting and just like a little bit tragic to say, you know, if you're not for inclusion, then you're against inclusion, which is pretty bad. And you shouldn't be leading a third sector organization if you don't want to be inclusive.
It's a weird one as well. Yeah, I think somebody mentioned it a while back. I can't remember who it was, but they said nobody's ever asked to build a business case against inclusion. You know, nobody's ever asked to justify why it's a bad thing to do. And when we start looking at things in terms of the financial, the social, the sustainable, there's no way that you can convince me that being not being diverse or inclusive is going to add anything to any dimension of your organization.
Mm-hmm. It just makes, you know, your organization less good. And to me, it's a no-brainer, you know, but I think also because, you know, I am existing across multiple lines of, you know, oppression. So for me, like any organization that isn't inclusive, like they wouldn't get someone as talented as me. Why would you not want that? You know?
I agree wholeheartedly with you. Yeah, I think it does come down to that. You know, you miss out on amazing people just because, and it might not be a thing where you miss out on them completely, because I think there's a trend towards trying to recruit in diversity. So you might get them, but you're never gonna retain them, and you're never gonna get the best out of them.
Yeah, that's true. And I think, you know, there's an organization that I started working with like early in my career, and on my first day, I got a racist microaggression from a member of staff who spent my entire time there basically trying to belittle me, you know, all of this stuff. And I just never brought my whole self to that organization. I never cared to work that hard. Like, I do the bare minimum, you know. I knew that, like, you know, I wasn't trying to make anything of it, because I was like, well, this organization didn't respond to that microaggression at all. In fact, you know, no one really recognized it as a microaggression because everyone was white. And actually, you know, they could have got an amazing 7 years out of me, but actually they got a mediocre 1.5 years. And look what I've done since.
Look at you now, Martha. Look at you now.
And a really nice quote come in from Alan. He just says, a diverse, positive work culture will have better customer interactions across the board. This not only drives a positive narrative about your brand, but increases productivity and financial returns. If you take care of the human factor, make it the priority, everything else falls into place. Absolutely. So the last kind of topic area for discussion is for you, Matt, which is about how do we then go about creating a successful EDI strategy?
Yeah, a really good question. I'm conscious that we've been asked this question so many times in the last call and since. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time addressing it now. I've got some slides to go through. I'm not going to take up too much time because I'm conscious that the chat's buzzing. We've got questions that came in advance that I want to speak to. So yeah, bear with me for like 5 minutes and then we will get into it. Okay, let's see if I can figure out how to work this. Yes, as an equal group, obviously our mission is to help organizations really speed up the rate at which they make improvements in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, typically using data and technology where we can. Our general approach is to use the data as a starting point, identify any operational gaps, set strategic targets, so being really specific about what you want to do, where you want to do it, creating interventions around that. There's no point kind of doing generic work. You need to be really specific in terms of what you're trying to achieve, and then embed mechanisms to track that over time. So it's about refining, replanning and repeating that process. In terms of the, what working with us looks like, we typically do it on an annual cycle. So really we see it more as a partnership. There are aspects that we will encourage and empower you as an organization to do. There's bits that we can help you with in terms of facilitating and empowering your team to take ownership of this work. We'd never want to create a dependency. We feel as an organization, you should be fully independent. You should feel confident to do this work. We don't want you to be wholly dependent on us because that isn't a win for anyone. I'll just break down what kind of a typical annual cycle looks like. So the initial piece of work is a little bit of consultation to understand what it is that you're trying to do, what are the problems that you're trying to overcome, and then we'll do a little bit of fact finding, typically by way of audit, so understanding what your data tells us about your organization. Where possible, talking to individuals about kind of some of the things that they're seeing on a day-to-day basis. And then the output of that is a formal report whereby we'll give you some of our recommendations, highlight to you some of the things that have that are potential gaps within your organization, and consider what kind of long-term work looks like. Just to dig into that audit process a little bit more. So we typically start with engagement. So it's really about understanding your intentions for doing this work, developing some comms around that. So ensuring that your members of staff understand exactly what you're trying to do, what the link is with your organization. As Martha touched on earlier, it's about mission. So understanding your mission and how EDI supports that. We'll then do some form of data collection, whether that's EDI data in terms of demographics or focus groups and talking to people. Then we'll, as I said, do some reporting recommendations, and we'll go into a bit of a follow-up period to understand what further work needs to be done. So that further work typically is in the way of a strategic response. So understanding specifically what solutions need to be designed, looking at policies, procedures, processes where they need to be amended, and really creating an environment whereby you're able to achieve success in relation to equality, diversity, and inclusion. We'll embed kind of a dashboard approach whereby we'll continue to look at the metrics, continue to revisit the data to ensure that we're being really specific about the interventions that we make going forward. Q3 is more about implementation. So having designed the solution in Q2, it's about implementing those solutions. And typically that will be in the form of either training, coaching, or campaign support. So really revising the way that we do things as an organization, giving license to different departments. So whether that's HR department, leadership team, really embedding a culture of equality, diversity, and inclusion going forward. We'll then, around the end of the year, so quarter four, look to analyze the impact of everything that we've done. So really being specific about what we're measuring, how we're measuring it, giving staff the ability to feedback about some of the things that they're seeing, some of the things that they want to see more of, less of, and really iterating to make sure that when we kick off the work again in Q1 of the next year, that you are in a better position having taken in some of the feedback from your workforce. So yeah, that's kind of what I had to talk about in relation to strategy. Becky, should we go to some questions from either the chat or anything we received beforehand?
Yeah, I've got we've probably got time for a couple of questions. So the ones that have come in the chat. What I find so sad and discouraging, as a smaller Black-led charity, we have had so many consecutive no's around resources lost out to bigger white-led charities. They want to know, how can we make sure that resources are equally shared?
I think that's a really good observation. I think there's a lot of Black-led organisations that are in a similar boat. Typically, the system and the infrastructure is not necessarily set up for Black-led organisations to do that well when it comes to specifically tender processes. And I guess one of my observations coming from the corporate world is that a lot of these deals are kind of done before they go out for tender anyway. So you kind of find yourself in the back foot if you don't know the right people or don't have the right networks. I think some of it is being vocal, be kind of calling organisations out, asking for more of a justification as to why you've not been selected. Obviously, there are some lessons that we could potentially learn, but I think around the subcontracting route, really being specific about what are the things that you can do, potentially in collaboration as well with organisations, to say actually we might not have been successful this round, but we'd really like to consider working with you going forward. Are there any opportunities for us to learn? And partnership, obviously Nathan, who asked the question, I'm open to working with you guys, and I think you're an amazing organisation. Check out Legacy Foundation. Yeah, they do amazing work, especially in relation to engaging with diverse communities and kind of pushing the underrepresented and potentially minoritized groups. So, Martha, did you have anything to?
I've got so much to add on that. As we all know, this is my favourite topic of conversation. Hi, Nathan, it's nice to see you. So, I mean, yeah, it's really difficult, I think, when you are, the Black-led organisation, and really lots of these decisions are made for you by power, by foundations who are built on a legacy of slavery and colonisation. And actually, there is a lot of onus on these organisations to get better at capacity building, to learn how to do fundraising in XYZ way. And while there is space for that, like, the onus is really on these kind of funders who are not prioritizing anti-racism, who are not looking at what specific community needs are. There's a lot of onus on white organizations who actually go in like sharks and pitch for funding that is should be for BAME-led organizations. And I think the commercialization of the charity sector has made this into a very kind of competitive environment rather than a collaborative one. And I think, there's lots of room for organizations led by people of color to collaborate, but that's not enough. We need systemic change, right? And I think there's all of us, as individuals, have some level of power that we can use to lobby for change. We should be lobbying to these funders to, take anti-racism seriously. We should be, putting pressure on power to say enough is enough. And I think it's really difficult as the organization that kind of takes the brunt of systemic injustice to know like how to, you know, how to create opportunities for yourself. You know, there's lots of stuff going on in the sector around kind of capacity building for BAME-led organizations. I can see Patricia's on the call doing lots of amazing work around kind of, you know, Black philanthropy as well. And I think, yeah, a lot of it is kind of knowing what's happening in the kind of like funding and resource space, but also white people collecting their people, like ultimately, so having these conversations, because yeah, there's you know, there's two sides involved in this.
We've got a question come in from Amjad. They say that often we find that BAME groups are also not as inclusive. For example, more BAME charities will focus on South Asian communities but not deal with other communities. How do we ensure that diversity within BAME, or that there's diversity within BAME organisations as well? And there's a few other comments around this topic in the chat as well.
Yeah, do you want to go first, Matt?
Yeah, you go. I've got some thoughts about BAME.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, I think the more specific you can get around communities, actually the better. If you are an organization that's working with, you know, a Kenyan community, like, you're going to provide a really specific level of care that's that is going to be very specifically Kenyan, that actually is going to bring people into your organization and create, you know, services that are really designed with those people at heart. However, you know, when we're looking across, you know, we've got these Kenyan services. If we're excluding trans people and we're excluding, you know, LGBT Kenyans, I think that's where like that lack of inclusion is a real kind of problem, you know. But actually, I really think it's brilliant that there are some organisations that are focusing very specifically on communities, you know, on different racial and ethnic communities as well, because I think they can provide a level of care that organisations that are a bit broader around BAME can't actually. So I think, you know, there's ups and downs on both sides.
Yeah, I think I tend to have like a love-hate relationship with the term BAME. Obviously, in a lot of the data analysis that we do, we use the term BAME just to align ourselves in terms of what kind of some of the data observations are. And obviously, when you've got really specific communities, sometimes you can't demonstrate the you know, the observations around that without revealing identity. So you do need kind of group terms or umbrella terms. But I think you're completely right, Martha, in terms of, you know, what specifically you're talking about when you say BAME. You know, it's not a catch-all statement when we're talking about interventions, when we're talking about organisations, when we're talking about specific concerns that need to be addressed. So we need to really be deliberate in the way that we use the term. BAME is appropriate in some contexts and wholly inappropriate in other contexts. It's really about understanding the nuance between the intersections that sit at the heart of that term. So I think there needs to be, I guess, more acknowledgement for what the expectation is around some of these groups as well. I think obviously the original comment around kind of South Asian communities, and even that South Asian community, what specific community are we talking about? That's a huge demographic. So really it's about being as specific as we can when we're talking about the expectations of what different organizations are set up to achieve, where possible, really holding companies to account. You know, if there is if they've positioned themselves and if they've attracted funding to support a large umbrella community, and they are not necessarily doing that in an appropriate way. It's about, as you said, being vocal and really understanding what more needs to be done in order to kind of encompass more of a wider demographic than potentially is currently being looked at.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of gets to the heart of some of these lived experience conversations. I think, you know, if we're using BAME as this big umbrella catch-all term, then, you know, my lived experience is the same as, you know, someone from, I'm just gonna say Azerbaijan, or someone from, like, you know, Afghanistan, or someone who is Chinese. And I am quite clearly a Black woman. So, you know, I think, yeah, being as specific as possible is really important. And actually, what does lived experience mean? I think one of the more interesting things that happened in the conversation around funding and allocation of resources last year was in Comic Relief's Global Majority Fund. They stipulated lived experience being, you know, more than just BAME. They said, you know, if you are working with Kenyan communities, I keep using Kenyan as the example, then you should be led by Kenyan people. At least 51% of your leadership, your trustees, should be Kenyan. And I think, you know, it's a very specific level of care. And I think it's a really incredible way to allocate funding to ensure that actually we are giving organizations who can reach those people who are not hard to reach. They have been historically excluded. But there are organizations who are specialists in doing that. And when we start using BAME as that catch-all term, and kind of, God forbid, white organizations working with BAME communities start pitching for those funds as well. That's why we need that distinction about lived experience, and that's why we should be as specific as possible.
Yeah, that's really good. Thank you, Martha. A question coming from Stuart. I work for a smaller art organisation, although we have lots of volunteers and there aren't big budgets. What are the things we can do before we engage external help to get the most out of the investment?
Okay, so I think there's so much information out there in terms of what you can do, things to try. I think where you've not got a budget, you're potentially limited, but the thing that will go further than budget is intention. You know, so as a leadership team, is this something that you prioritize? And if it is something that you prioritize, how do you communicate that to your volunteers, to your staff? There's a lot of progress that you can make with having a structure around what you do. So some of the slides I shared earlier about the strategy side of things, I think there's things that you can do yourself. You know, just being intentional about the gaps that you're trying to close, being intentional about what you're trying to achieve, having a clear vision, a clear articulation for the type of organization that you want to be, and working towards it in the same way that you'll set targets and objectives around financial performance, the same way that you will set targets and measures around what you want to do for specific communities, is the same way that you need to approach equality, diversity, inclusion. So being really, really specific about what it is you're trying to achieve, how you want to achieve it, who needs to be involved. So whether that's staff, whether it's a leadership team, whether that's volunteers, what your expectations are for each of these groups. And yeah, I think there's a lot of progress that you can make internally with a very little budget. Yeah, it's just about how badly do you want it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really agree. I mean, again, if we're seeing this as integral to your work, you know, whatever your role is, if you're in a leadership team, like EDI should be part of your operations, your fundraising, your finance, whatever. I always think, you know, it's so important. It sounds ridiculous, but it's so important to just practice, like talking about EDI, practice talking about race, practice talking about where we've gone wrong, and practice apologizing. And that you can do for free, right? Like, I think something that's really interesting, you know, I've been doing anti-racism training across the charity sector, and actually having a space for leadership to practice talking, using the words around racism, practice actually, you know, humility and, you know, acknowledging some of their faults, makes the training go so much smoother, because there's like so much less defensive-ness. And I think if you've never practiced even saying, you know, when people whisper the word black, you know, like, oh my God, black people. Because you've not practiced, you know, you're not comfortable with it. And I think, you know, there's this misconception with leadership, like you've got to this director position, therefore you know absolutely everything, right? And actually there's so much that you don't know, there's so much that you need to practice. And yeah, there's that kind of that level of humility, and actually just the fact that, you know, you're not going to be an expert in EDI or race, or, you know, even learning French, you know, if you've taken one lesson or you've had one conversation, like you have to keep doing this continuously until it becomes part of who you are and how you work. Yeah,
and it takes courage. I think one of the things that I've seen when we've seen kind of organizations get the best out of doing this equality, diversity, inclusion work, it's where leaders are courageous, where leaders are open, vulnerable, transparent about the fact that, you know, we're not going to get this right first time. You're not. Like, let's face it, you know, as your analogy in terms of speaking French or learning French, you're not going to get it right the first time. You're gonna say some words, you mispronounce certain things. You're gonna, you know, get the grammatical side of things wrong. This is such a nuanced area, so we need to be really transparent about the fact that we're really human. And the more you have those conversations, the more you can practice humility and apologizing, saying sorry, the easier it becomes, and people get more of an insight for how genuinely you want this.
I love that. I love the fact that we just say it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to not know everything, and you know, it really takes the pressure off. So I think we've got time for one more question. Tolu has asked if we have any tips for challenging notions of adhering to governance and accountability as reasons for white leadership to be involved in EDI groups, making final decisions, so it's not a tick box exercise. How do we better encourage non-hierarchical co-production within white-led organisations? Long-winded question, but I hope you got the gist.
That was the longest. It was quite a complex question as well. Martha, did you want to have a crack?
I'm literally like furiously.
I think there's about 4 questions in there.
All right, let me try and take some of this. I think that, you know, if leaders think that they can do this, they would have already done it, right? So I think, you know, it kind of the buck stopping with leadership, like we can see that has completely failed. So we need to try something new, right? And actually, you know, who is going to be leading the organization in 5 years from now? You know, who's going to be leading the organization in 10 years from now? Why aren't we creating a culture that kind of supports them? They are already in the organization already, you know, so we should be thinking about succession. You know, we're not here to like sit as leaders and like sit there forever and actually like dig in our heels and prevent change. We should be looking at succession all the time, right? And actually, how do we create pathways for people with protected characteristics to get to that point? And if they were there already, and if leadership was able to do that on their own, we wouldn't be in this situation that we're in right now, right? So I think there's something about parting with your ego, realizing that you can't do it, and actually you have people within your organization who can. And I think, again, it's always talking about power, you know, EDI, anti-racism, all of that stuff is looking at kind of shifting the balances of power. And that can't be done with decisions being made by power. You know, power doesn't concede to anything without a fight, right? Without somebody challenging it. It's absolutely impossible for this to be done within the leadership team. And I don't know if that really answers your question well enough. I feel like it was such a good question. I've been a bit flawed.
It was. I think it was. I think there are so many layers to the question. I think one of my reflections, obviously, you mentioned kind of governance, accountability. So in previous life, I focused heavily on regulation and governance. And one of the things that I would encourage leaders to do is to see this as a key risk. You know, this has implications in terms of your ability to be a sustainable organization. So if we're looking at things from a governance perspective, not getting this right, you know, undermines everything that you might want to put in place around governance, around the credibility and sustainability of the organization going forward. Therefore, it must be seen in a way that, you know, it's kind of as serious as fundamental to how you exist as an organization. I think there needs to be a level of accountability across the organization, and you know, having kind of an all-white leadership team or an all-male leadership team is a risk, and that does expose you to things that you might not necessarily be aware of just due to a lack of lived experience. So it's, you know, the onus is on you as a leadership team to understand how you can accommodate for those weaknesses, in the same way that if you had a leadership team and nobody had financial management experience, you'd go and you'd find somebody with financial management experience to come and help you, because you understand this is important to the way that we run as an organization. The same with marketing, the same with technology. This is just part of being a good leader. You identify the gaps within your leadership team and you fill them.
Yeah, I love that.
Sounds really simple when I say it like that, but
it is.
Yeah.
It is really simple.
That's really good, Mac. It kind of adds to the business case as well, like the way you position that about risk. I like that. So that's kind of all we've got time for in terms of questions and answers. but we will be sending out emails so that we can help further in answering your questions. But Matt, are you able to bring the slides back up in closing?
Yeah.
Cool. So what are the next steps? So if you've enjoyed this webinar, please do engage with us on social media. Also, you can join our mailing list over on theequalgroup.com. You can subscribe there, and we do a bi-weekly roundup of all the EDI news that's going on. Please feel free to also recommend us and our webinars to any of your colleagues. And then the next way we'd love for you to engage with us is to actually book a consultation if you felt that, you know, we've touched on the surface of some of the issues that you're struggling with. Then let's delve a little bit deeper. Let's see how we can unpack that further and maybe come alongside you or give you some practical tips specific and bespoke to the issue that you are facing. So please feel free to book a consultation. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. But again, thank you so much for joining us today. Martha, thank you for coming again. Matt, you've been amazing as always. So everybody have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you again very soon.
Great, thank you. Speak soon.
Bye everyone.